Hey everybody, Joseph Rothschild here, aka MBT, and we're doing one of these again! It's been a while since we've done tier list content. That's probably because for the last couple of months, what did you want me to do? Stand in front of a camera and say you should be playing Snake Eye for the 16th week in a row? But now that Legacy of Destruction has released and we've got a couple of weeks under our belt with the new ban list, I think the metagame has settled in a really interesting position, and for that reason I want to talk about what I think is going to be playable in this resultant metagame. I'm not going to do the hour-long tier list video where I tell you if I think Goblin Biker is playable. It isn't. So I've reduced it down to just the decks that I think have the potential to be consistently good. We're going to sort these into tiers 1, 2, 3, and stop coping. And I want to be clear, I don't think the differences between the tiers are so monumental that a deck from tier 2 will never be able to beat a deck from tier 1, or tier 3 to tier 1, or even the stuff I put in stop coping. They all have potential. So for those of you that are still here and didn't click right there and scroll to the end, let's get into it. First up in tier 1, you should be playing Snakes. Joseph, why even do a tier list if you were just going to put this deck at the top of tier 1 once again? Well, a lot has changed for Snake Eye. After the loss of Baron and Borreload Savage, this deck became a lot more vulnerable. There's a ton of cards that do cook Snake Eye alive, but can't compete with an Omni Negate. That said, this deck is still really good. Now, why is that? Well, mostly I think it's because it's the most adaptable of any of the decks on this list. It's got a pretty good matchup spread, it's mostly favored versus mostly everything, where I think a lot of the decks lower on the metagame tier list have the ability to take a ton of games off of the top tier meta, but really fall apart against rogue strategies. In the interim between the ban of Borreload and Baron and now, duelists have figured out a ton of other stuff you can do with this engine, be it play Omega into Despotter, or the Hot Red Dragon stuff, or even nothing. Some people are seeing success with only Link monsters in the extra deck, due in large part to the release of a new card in Legacy of Destruction, Snake Eye Diabellstar. I think time will tell as to how good this card is. Consensus seems to be that it is fine and probably warrants inclusion in the deck, but isn't going to be the difference maker as to whether this deck is really good or unbeatably strong. Personally, I think the card fills in a ton of gaps for the strategy, and I think you will see those gaps filled more effectively as people come out with new combos in the coming weeks. Unsurprisingly, I feel confident saying this is the best deck in the format, and honestly, it's the only thing I'm going to put in tier 1. Let's go on to tier 2. Okay, I was really wrong about this one. First deck in tier 2 is Tenpai. So I know I said this deck was terrible, and what happened? I guess I just didn't believe in the battle phase enough. Tenpai is a really difficult deck to place. It's got a lot of things going for it. For instance, the deck above it, Snake Eye, has the capacity to play really elegantly through one hand trap and usually through 2, but almost never through 3, and this deck has the unique ability to play 31 pieces of non-engine and 9 engine cards. Because this deck works the way it does, you can't even really macro around it. You can force them to go first, but because their grip is going to include a bunch of hand traps, they're just going to pass under the assumption that you won't be able to OTK them through all their hand traps, and then they'll be able to just try for the OTK on your turn anyway, with maybe an additional point of interaction like a Fenrir or a Spheres up. The combo is frustratingly easy to execute, which means over the course of a long tournament, you are unlikely to screw it up the same way you might be able to screw up a Snake Eye line that has to account for different hand traps at different points. And while Dragion specifically is really expensive, the rest of the deck is pretty much dirt cheap, so you're going to be seeing it a lot. The thing that makes it uniquely hard to position, though, is I think that we may have already discovered the ceiling on this strategy. I went into this a little more in a Farfa Twitter thread from earlier this week, but the thing about Tenpai is it feels like it wins or loses based on 0 inputs from either player. Whether you're playing with or against it, you're just going to open up a hand, see how many hand traps and starters it has, and compare that to your opponent's ability to play. If you open 4 hand traps and 2 starters in a 6-card hand, congratulations, you've won. No amount of throwing those hand traps away is going to recount for the amount your opponent is going to have to interact with you in order to prevent you from winning. And if you don't do that, you probably lose. I think there's a pretty good chance that this deck becomes a lot worse as individuals get more comfortable playing against it, but the cards that beat this strategy are either so narrow that they don't have a lot of application against other strategies, and as the metagame widens, it's going to be less possible for you to fit those into sideboards, or they're just annoying ass lingering floodgates. A D-barrier. Hooray, it's back. Next up is Voiceless Voice. Ever the bridesmaid, Voiceless Voice has spent a lot of time being a top 3 deck, but not a top 1 deck now. It's got a lot going for it. It's got a combo that doesn't require too much investment on the part of the player. It's probably got the highest density of spell cards that read win you the game immediately in it. And like the deck above it in Snake Eye, it got a really powerful card in LEDE that isn't going to be the difference maker, but is nice to have. Unfortunately, Voiceless Voice has the classic ritual deck problems. Sometimes your deck full of power spells has too many of the same power spell, and you really kind of need a diversity of them in order to do anything. Post-board, your opponent is going to have unbelievable tools at their disposal, either through the Bestials or, God forbid, Dimensional Barrier, calling Ritual. And the ceiling's low enough that a lot of times you are going to have to back up your unbeatable end board with, like, a piece or two of non-engine to have game against some of the more adaptable decks in the format. That said, it's still really strong. And the last deck I feel comfortable putting in tier 2 is this Fire King Snake Eye. When the bans were first revealed, I think a lot of people assumed that Fire King Snake Eye would just be the de facto way to play the deck. Oh, like instead of getting Jet Synchron, we're just going to get Ponix off of original Sinful Spoils, right? But as the metagame developed more, I think it became clear that that's not fantastic. I think what people are discovering is while you do get an end board that's a little more layered by virtue of playing the Fire King cards in Snake Eye, those aren't often the difference makers, and they come at the opportunity cost of playing like 7 Garnets in your main deck. That can be fine in a format where your opponent is probably also playing Snake Eye, and you're going to get into this big gummy board state almost immediately. You're going to have to simplify it over the course of a couple of turns. It's good to have cards that recur themselves in that scenario, but in a format where like Tenpai exists, you can't really afford to be missing individual cards in an opener. I think this deck is really good, and in many ways an improvement over Snake Eye Pure, but I think it has a much more pronounced ability to produce hands that just suck ass in a format where that is just a death sentence. All right, let's do tier 3. Top of tier 3, I am putting Yubel. Yubel is an interesting ass deck, man. So like a lot of individuals, I just sort of assumed that this deck would be kind of DOA until we got Soul of Yubel or Phantom of Yubel, whatever they're calling that card, non-binary pride. But the deck's already really powerful. It turns out a lot of strategies still can't beat the Unchained style Fiend Link setups. Now that Omni Negates are kind of at a premium, that rank 10 is really, really good. And it does have the capacity on a simplified board state to just sort of accidentally kill your opponent out of nowhere. That said, there are a number of downsides to Yubel, of course. Firstly, the combos are mostly 2 and 3 card ones. Like you're going to have to spend a lot of resources in order to get your engine off the ground, which means you are uniquely interruptible in a format where one deck is playing 31 pieces of non-engine. You kind of have to manage your front row and your back row because cards like Nightmare Pain are so integral to your setup. And at the end of the day, you're playing Yubel and Ultimate Nightmare. So sometimes you'll just open those and just be like, oh, fuck, I guess I lose. After that, we've got Kashtira. Man, what do you want me to say about Kashtira? It's fucking Kashtira, man. People have figured out funny things you can do with this archetype. You can make like Heat Soul. Someone at Locals last week made Harmonizer Gradiel against me, and I went, okay. But it's just Kashtira, you know? It's just Kashtira. Deck that plays a ton of hand traps, including Shifter, and also has the capacity to just grind them out on Fenrir's. Personally, I think this deck's matchup spread is absolutely abysmal, which would prevent me from ever bringing it to an event. But I can't deny that there's something elegant in its simplicity. Like, think about how much cold fusion you have to do to play Snake Eyes optimally over the course of a 9-round tournament. Think how much easier it would be to just summon a unicorn and activate its effect. Next up, Melodious. So I think I made a short in which I said I thought the dominant build of Melodious was going to be that like Supreme King Gate Magician plus Melodious Slop Pendulum deck. But the deck's now got like 3 or 4 tops just playing pure, and I think it's here to stay. So the thesis of this deck is that like Branded, Ostinato is an incredibly powerful card that wins you the game on the spot. Just drowns your opponent in advantage and threatens an absolutely unthinkable amount of material. There's a couple Towers monsters in this archetype that some of the decks above it have a really difficult time outing, and you're going to get into some very funny arguments about how the Loving Defender Forever interacts with Bloom Diva. I'm putting it at tier 3 in the moment because I feel like the decks that are already topping feel a little YouTube to me. Like super focused on synergies and trying to build towards that stupid end board with like the person who can't be destroyed and the person who can't be targeted and no one can be destroyed by battle. But that's already alright. I would not be surprised to see this deck improve over the coming weeks and move upwards. Notably, this is about Melodious the deck, not Melodious the engine, which is already seeing a lot of experimentation in, of course, Pendulum decks, but also in Snake Eyes. I think Melodious Snake Eyes almost won the most recent YCS, and even in Voiceless Voice. A lot of potential in that one. Next up is Pearly. I'm going to be honest, the only reason this isn't in the Stop Coping tier is because of exactly Dinka Pham, who seems unbeatable on the strategy. Pearly's still Pearly, man. It's at the end of the day, it's still Pearly. On that note, Branded is still Branded. I think I like Branded a little bit less than Pearly right now. Branded's in such a weird position. Like, duelists like Pack can take it to unbelievable highs, but its highest ceiling boards do require a bunch of cards that are already on the field to resolve, which becomes less and less possible as people are jamming worse and worse non-engine in their decks. You know, you have to compete not only with Ash Blossom, but against Tenpai, like 14 other hand traps that are devastating. There's a lot of build diversity in this strategy. I've seen a lot of individuals blind seconding with power spells, which is like cool, but in my opinion, not something that the format is totally unprepared for. Oh, I know I didn't put Chimera on this list, and a lot of people are going to go like, Joseph, where's Chimera? Don't you know they have a line that goes like Beatrice Reborn Statue? Listen, if you're trying to fusion summon and then lock your opponent out of their plays, just play Branded. Next up is Lab. I feel like I'm putting all the decks that just didn't change in tier 3, and that's probably because None of these decks changed while the ones above them adapted. Labyrinth is still Labyrinth. It can still start playing on turn 0. It can still wax people who are absolutely unprepared to beat back row. The problem is, of late, I've seen a lot of people really prepared to beat back row. People are almost universally boarding like Cosmic Cyclone now. Bells are creeping back into lists, which is really rough for the Labyrinth traps. A lot that could be going a lot better for the Butlers. Next up is Centurion. So Centurion got a new card that improves one of the pieces in their existing game plan, but doesn't really radically transform the game plan at all. You know, so let's, you know. And finally, Fluonderies. I'm going to be honest with you, I really don't like Fluonderies during this format. It feels like it's uniquely weak to the types of cards that decks like Tenpai will be playing. Like, under the right conditions, it loses to Ash and Valor and Imperm and Droll and Nibiru and Ghost Ogre, but it is playing Shifter and it's got one-card combos. Personally, I don't see a ton of advantages to playing this deck over a deck like Kashtira, but it seems to creep into top cuts, so who am I to say? This marks the end of Tier 3, which means that if your deck has not yet been mentioned, I'm so sorry. First up in the Cope tier is Memento. Memento is in a very strange place. It is getting results at present. And I think we all assume that after the new cards come out, it's going to be like a force to be reckoned with. At present, it is a really powerful strategy, but not so powerful that I think it can consistently go toe-to-toe with the stuff above it. I think the reason I have this in the stop coping tier is just because I know it's about to be so good, and it isn't yet. It's certainly got a lot more game than the rest of the decks that I'm about to talk about. Next up is Runic. Boy, we had a fun couple of weeks pretending that stun deck was playable, huh? But now that the metagame has diversified, and diversified in such a way that not every deck even loses to those floodgates anymore, I think we can safely call it on this one. After that is Sky Striker. So, Sky Striker is fine. It has results. The unfortunate truth of the matter is that the resource loop that was so powerful in 2019 just doesn't really hold a candle to the ones that are available now. In fact, all of the decks in Tier 1 and Tier 2, I think, outclass even Sky Striker in terms of just seeing more cards over the course of their turn. It's weird to be like, yeah, you can engage like 2 or 3 or even 4 times in a singular turn, but like Snake Eye Ash is still a +7. Add to that the fact that even the so-called control decks in the modern era can just OTK you if given the opportunity, and it's really hard to justify a deck like Sky Striker, which is still going to take a couple of turns to get off to the races. After that is Rescue Ace. Man, remember when we thought this was going to be the premier way to play cards like Dia Bellstar? Rescue Ace is a cool deck that sets up an awesome back row, but it has less ability to play through hand traps than Snake Eye, less ability to play through boards than Snake Eye, less offensive pressure than Snake Eye. I just don't want to talk about it. Hero. So Hero just got top 4 in like a DB grinder tournament, which is something, I guess. I think a lot of people expected this deck might be playable by virtue of Malicious going from 2 to 3, but unfortunately, it doesn't really matter. The combos are streamlined in such a way that you don't need more than 2 Malicious because they already gave heroes Malicious's number 3 and 4 in Denier. The 5th Malicious doesn't make a difference as to whether the board is unbreakable or completely breakable, and it also doesn't really permit it to play around more hand traps either because, like, the choke point for the Malicious is an Ash Blossom, and if they Ash Malicious, it's just as bad. You know, you're still banishing it. Rough. And then finally, Thunder Dragon. I think people kind of assumed there would be some sort of like Tearlament, Bestial, Horus, Lightsworn, Thunder Dragon deck available somewhere. But the unfortunate truth is I don't think any of those decks are remotely playable at present. But here's what we're going to do with Thunder Dragon. We're just going to put it all the way up here in bottom of Tier 1 so that people who skip to the end of the video will be confused and talk about it in the comments. If you didn't do that, good on you. So that's about where I land. I gotta be honest, as much as I want to hate this format because decks like Tenpai are annoying and Snake Eye is still the top dog, I can't help but enjoy it at least a little bit. Snake Eye is a pretty enjoyable deck to try to get good at, and I gotta be honest, the existence of some decks that are a little simpler and play lower to the ground, like Tenpai and Voiceless Voice, makes it so that I can go to locals and feel like I'm playing against players who at minimum grasp what they're doing. And there's a lot of cool developments that could happen in the coming weeks. The refinement of a pre-Phantom Yubel list, Melodious being splashed in more stuff, Tearlament making any appearance at all. I think we are in for a much more fun format than the last one. Bye-bye.